Welcome, and today we're going to talk about taxonomy. We're going to spend the next few days on this. It's a pretty straightforward and easy uh, um, topic to cover, uh, but it does have its issues. It's not. Um, uh, it's straightforward and it's easy, but there's just some little quirks that I think that you need to learn, and also just realize that this is a very flexible and changing science. It's constantly changing. So we actually are going to start with classification and just think of things that you classify, right? What's something that maybe you put into categories. One of the favorite ones I like to talk about in class is music. Students love to classify music. And, everyone has a certain type of music that they listen to. And if you ask them about it, usually a student can tell me exactly the type of music they listen to. And it's usually not very general. I mean, occasionally I get something like, I listen to rap or I listen to country or rock. But a lot of times, um, especially like with any type of rock music, people can get very, very specific because there's a wide variety even within in rock music itself. I mean, really, um, there are country artists and rap artists that have been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So, I mean, you've already got that as a debate. But let's just start, like, for example, with Taylor Swift. Lover, hater, whatever, doesn't matter. A lot of students will argue about how to classify her as an artist, whether she's actually a country artist or not. And there's a lot of artists like that. Like we could have a long discussion about like all these different artists and what their classification is. And sometimes it changes as they develop as an artist. Like they release an album that's more one genre versus another. Okay, so here it's showing that you can classify. Sorry, they're showing you that you can classify different types of minerals. Which I mean, yes, you can do that. We classify cars. Um, some students are very passionate about cars, and so I can mention, a particular type of car, and I could say, well, this is a sports car, and they're like, well, that's not really a sport. Like that's just a model the company made to make it look like a sports car, but that's not really a sports car, you know. And so, a lot of people are passionate about a lot of this stuff, and that tends to make some sense, that we definitely feel we like to organize things and we like to understand how the world around us is organized. So, one of the first people to organize life was Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher, and he divided everything into plants and animals, which actually lasted a really long time. I mean, even when we have our first good classification system, I'm sorry, Aristotle, your classification system had some major problems. They still kind of stuck with this whole animals versus plants. Basically, if it was a living thing, it either moved around or it had something growing into the dirt and stayed in place. Now, today we know that that's not necessarily completely true in terms of like with animals. We have bacteria and we have other microscopic organisms known as protists that can move around. And even though they're animal-like, they're not truly animals. And like for example, fungi are not plants, even though they grow in the earth. They don't photosynthesize, so they're very different than plants. As a matter of fact, fungi are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. Um, and then he divided animals into red-blooded or not red-blooded. In other words, basically, something that had what we today would call vertebrates and invertebrates. So, that as much as I just bashed on his classification system a second ago, I mean, he did have a good foundation for what we still use even today. The problem comes in that he based everything on habitat and lifestyle or morphology, basically their shape. So, what might be some problems based on their habitat and lifestyle? Well, think of two animals that kind of live the same way but aren't related. Sharks and dolphins. Are they classified as being related? Well, not very closely. I mean, one's a cartilage fish and one's a mammal, not closely related really at all. Um, how did they get their body shapes that they have? And that's the morphology. Well, that's through convergent evolution, right? And we know that today, but at the time, he would have classified them as being related. What are two things that fly that maybe aren't very closely related? Well, what about like birds and bats? Birds and bats would be more closely related, like for example, a sparrow and a bat, than an emu or an ostrich would be related to the sparrow, according to Aristotle. So that was some major problems right there. Um, some of it is just a little bit of common sense type stuff. You just got to think about it a little bit. But I mean, at the time, it's what they had. So this kind of sticks around until we get to this guy named Carolus Linnaeus, also called Carl Linné. Carolus Linnaeus was a Latinization of his name. And he comes up with the binomial system, or also known as binomial nomenclature. And it's a two-name naming system is what binomial nomenclature means. And it uses the genus and species name to identify the organism. In other words, the two most specific epithets, which are again a name in a series for that particular organism. So, for example, we can classify humans as being vertebrates, so that actually is phylum Chordata. Kingdom Animalia, so we got to get even more general than that. So, Kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, we're class Mammalia. And, you keep going, and there's all these different classifications, and we get down to our genus is Homo, which means same. All right, so it's the same genus as humans. And then sapiens, right? Homo sapiens is the genus and species name, and so we go by the species name, Homo sapiens or H. sapiens, for humans. And this whole system is based on a hierarchy. I started to get into this, but I kind of let it go for a second because I knew I was going to come back to it here. So understand a taxon is any grouping of the organisms. We have these different taxons, and it's based on hierarchy where you start and you're really, really general. I mean, for example, Kingdom Animalia. Those are animals. Think of all the animals that you know. Maybe you have a cat and a dog, a goldfish. Those are animals. Here's the thing, even a sea sponge is considered an animal. And they don't seem very animal-like. Jellyfish, they're an animal. Squids, animals. Like, it's a wide variety of organisms. That little cockroach that just scurried across the floor, it's an animal. All right, so that's pretty general. And then we want to get more specific. So if we think of what does hierarchy mean, the easiest analogy, and it's actually where this comes from, is when we talk about socio-political structures of the Middle Ages. And so, like, for example, you would have a very large number of peasants. Pretty much so, most of the kingdom was made up of peasants. And they would pay taxes, they'd live on the land and work and give most of a good chunk of what they made on their farms towards these lords. And the lords actually were divided up into even different structures as well, because you could have like these lower level lords that basically they owned land, and they had a bunch of peasants working their land, and those lords maybe reported up to a higher level lord, and there were fewer of those higher level lords, and then they reported up to, like, for example, a king. All right, and there would be usually one king per country. And so it's kind of the same idea here with this hierarchy. You have a whole bunch of animals fitting into this, well, a whole bunch of organisms fitting into animals. But if we want to go towards humans, then we would say, all right, we belong to the kingdom Animalia, but the phylum, so phylum is a little bit more specific, Chordata. Chordata is anything with we'll say for now, a backbone. It's not exactly correct, but close enough. So anything that's considered a vertebrate or having a backbone fits in the phylum Chordata, right? And what does that include? What are things that have backbones? Well, humans, mammals, all mammals are fit into that. Birds have backbones. Fish have backbones. What about snakes? Yes, snakes do have backbones. Any type of reptile does. So lizards, turtles, frogs, all the amphibians. You see, all of these fit into kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata. Now, which of those are we? We are mammals, things with hair. Okay, so that's what unites our group. And what are some mammals? I mean, now we can't include the snakes and the frogs and the fish, but we're still going to include, like, humans, cats, dogs, a horse, cows. They all have hair, so they belong to kingdom, phylum, class Mammalia. What order do we belong to? Well, we belong to the order of primates. And primates are characterized by basically having thumbs. So, kingdom, phylum, class Mammalia, order, we belong to order primate. And then we belong to the family hominid. Hominids are human-like. Basically, they're human-like group of apes. All right, they're a specific group within the ape family. So we are hominids. And we belong to the genus Homo, which is specific to basically the most human, upright walking apes. All right, so you have to be upright walking. There's some other characteristics that go in there. And then species is the last one. So we're Homo sapiens. Here we go. So here we have all these animals, 3 types of bears, a fox, a squirrel, a snake, and a sea star. Those are all animals. Now, chordata, we don't include the sea star. A little bit more specific. Have to have a backbone, and sea stars do not. Class Mammalia, again, things with fur. Order Carnivora, things that eat meat more or less, is what this group is. And so we have the 2 bears, the 3rd bear, and the fox. Now, Ursidae is the bear family. And that means the fox isn't included, but we still have the 3 bears. Now, panda bears are kind of distantly related to these other 2. All right, it kind of branches off really early. So the true bear genus is, we have this brown bear and this black bear. And the species here is Ursus arctos. So Ursus arctos is the brown bear, also known as grizzly bear. So here we have 2 species of bear, and notice that one is the American brown bear and one is the Asiatic brown bear, also known as sun bear. These guys are found in Asia. And notice everything's here up until, so we start with, now a domain's a different thing, we'll talk about it, all the way up until we get to the species name. By the way, I did have a mnemonic device. You do need to know this because you need to be able to compare which one's, made up of more organisms or less organisms. There will be test questions that will ask you, which one's more inclusive, which one's less inclusive, which one's more specific, which one contains the other one, stuff like that. And so basically memorize this, okay? There's a couple ways of memorizing this. A couple different sayings, like King Philip came over from Greece singing. That way you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Kings play chess on funny green squares. That's fine. There's something about King Philip cuts out frog. Never mind. Anyways, there's a bunch of them out there. You can look one up on the internet and pick one that works for you. Okay. Now, a domain is kind of like a super kingdom. It's a bigger grouping. Basically, eukaryotes is our domain. So if you think about it, that includes a lot of microscopic organisms that have a nucleus. It was very important. We kind of went to the whole domain system in the 1980s after, I think it was 1978, they discovered that bacteria, not all bacteria were the same. Basically, you had prokaryotes and eukaryotes. A prokaryote doesn't have a nucleus. That includes just bacteria. Well, they found out there's actually 2 major groups of bacteria that are really, really different from each other. Genetically, not even ballpark of similar. And those guys are called archaea and eubacteria. Eubacteria means true bacteria. So And when they did that, they said, well, then all eukaryotes then belong to their own domain. And that's why it changed. And here it kind of talks about this 4, 5, or 6 kingdoms. And so for a long time, so Carolus Linnaeus, however you want to say his name, came up with the system. And at first he just had animals and plants, but it didn't take scientists very long to realize, hey, you know what? Mushrooms are not part of the plant kingdom. They're their own thing. So they gave them fungi, and then any single-celled microscopic organism they called Monera. So this was anything that was a prokaryote. Monera, mono meaning one. And then they quickly went to the 5 kingdom system, and actually you really see the 5 kingdom around a lot still. Like you'll see a lot of stuff in grade schools talking about this. It's still just around, even though it's out of date since like the 1980s. I know growing up and all the way through high school and college for me, I still saw quite a bit about the 5 kingdoms. And so we'll get there in a second, but what they did was they created another kingdom. They split fungi and realized that we had a bunch of stuff that just didn't quite fit as a fungus, a plant, or an animal. They kind of were their own thing, and this is Protista. Now, this is kind of a problem for classification. When you classify something, you usually have a set of characteristics that you classify it as. Like, for example, if I said something was a station wagon, and then it's got some souped-up race car engine on it, and only 2 doors, and no hatchback trunk on it or anything like that, like the hatchback trunk is missing, you'd be like, that's not a station wagon. Like, that's clearly not a station wagon. And that's because we have an idea of what cars are. And when we classify things, we know what they are. The problem with Protista is it's what it isn't. It's everything that's left over. It's kind of the garbage bin of classification. I mean, we know what a single-celled prokaryote is. Prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. So that's, our Monera or bacteria in the 5 kingdom system. And then we have Protista, everything that's left over. Okay, so fungi, again, decomposer, cell wall made out of chitin. It is a heterotroph, digests other things externally. Plants, they're photosynthesizers. They have cell walls made out of cellulose. We know what a plant is. We know what animals are. I mean, we got a good idea what an animal are. So plants, animal, fungi, we know what they are. We know what bacteria are. Protists is basically everything that's left over. Even today, a lot of scientists debate about whether Protista should even be a legitimate kingdom. Like, really, shouldn't it just be like a bunch of different kingdoms? Like right now, it's just an informal classification. And that's kind of where we're at with Protista. Now, what happened with bacteria? They did some RNA studies on some bacteria that they were looking at, and they found out that bacteria actually have 2 different ways of processing proteins. And so they divide it into 2 domains. Archaeobacteria, which is made up of one group of organisms, one kingdom, Archaea. And so these are bacteria that actually process proteins more similarly to us. And these guys are the extremists. They live in really strange environments that's hard for anything else to live in. Eubacteria are true bacteria. This is where most bacteria fit, and they have a very different way of synthesizing proteins. And so that's why these guys are so different and so not closely related. They found out eubacteria is more distantly, basically this Archaeobacteria, this ancient bacteria, is more closely related to us than true bacteria. And so it was so significant they divided that into 2 more kingdoms, which then caused us to have these 3 domains. Archaeobacteria, made of archaea. Eubacteria belongs to domain bacteria. And then we have Protista, fungi, plantae, plants, and Animalia, animals, which are, they belong to the group Eukarya. Those are all the eukaryotes, and so those are your super kingdoms. And here you can kind of see, eubacteria kind of splits off really early on. Archaeobacteria continues on evolving and living more similar to us, but then they branch off. And then we end up with the protists, which are eukaryotic, unicellular, and multicellular, but primarily unicellular. And then they kind of led to the three main other groups that we have, which are plants, animal, and fungi, which these three kind of do their own thing. So, and here's just another way of looking at this. So, what's a domain? It's kind of like a super kingdom. Some scientists break it into a two-domain system: prokarya and eukaryota. Not very many people use that today, though. And so, eventually, they got to the three-domain system: archaea, which is made up of archaea bacteria made of eubacteria. So, one kingdom in the domain bacteria. And then the domain eukarya, which gives us our plants, animal, and fungi. So, and here's kind of a breakdown of pretty much the rest of the year and how we're going to go about stuff. We have archaeobacteria, ancient bacteria, eubacteria, basically true bacteria, protists, which we're going to divide into algae, plant-like ones, protozoans, animal-like ones, and fungus-like protists. We're going to talk about fungus. Then we're going to talk about plants. Plants are subdivided into mosses, ferns, conifers, which are basically like your pine trees, if you think what a pine cone is, and then your flowering plants. And we divide them into two groups, monocots and dicots. And then finally, we talk about animals. Animals are divided into invertebrates and vertebrates, but really these invertebrates, these are each different phyla. We have sponges, cnidarians, worms, mollusks, arthropods, and echinoderms. All right, so these are our main invertebrates. We'll talk about some other ones in there. And then our vertebrates are sharks, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The last topic we're going to spend some time studying is what is known as a cladogram. And it's kind of like a family tree of organisms. It doesn't have to be animals. We tend to study animals with these, but it can be any type of organism. And so the way this is set up, this one's set up as a little bit more of this Y-shaped model, which is kind of convenient for a lot of people, but it isn't always. Sometimes it's more of like this family tree pedigree looking thing. So the idea is that we have common ancestors amongst these organisms. And this shows distance to that common ancestor. So we have animals evolving and changing. And eventually you get to some point where we have organisms with a spinal cord. And that's what all of these guys have. So since all of these guys have it, and this is the only trait that really unifies all of these different animals. I mean, this hagfish just looks almost like a worm. It's not. It's a type of jawless fish. But all of these guys have one thing in common, and that is that they have a spinal cord. So the common ancestor would have been right here, and it would have had a spinal cord. Now, jaws eventually is a thing. Like, imagine trying to bite into food without a jawbone. Not an easy thing to do. That's why these things basically like gnaw on the sides of fish, or in the case of hagfish. So that actually is a lamprey I described. A hagfish feeds on like dead and decaying stuff on the bottom of the ocean because it doesn't have jaws to break it apart. But everything else here has jaws. And so the common ancestor that would have jaws evolved sometime between hagfish and bony fish, which are perch. And so at this point, here, let me use the pen here. At this point right here, we are going to have a common ancestor. And that common ancestor between perch and all of these other animals had jaws. By the way, this point where we would have had a common ancestor, we call that a node. Now, fish don't have lungs, but everything else up here does have lungs. And so between the common ancestor with fish and everything else, and the salamander had a common ancestor with lizards, pigeons, mice, and chimps. Not, I say everything else, but I mean everything else that's further up the line, okay? And that's where we would have had the common ancestor. Sometime between here, point A, and point B, we would have had lungs develop. Now, everything that's up here has claws or nails, right? And so that happens sometime between point B, and now I'll call this point C. So this is, we're going to call this point C or node C. That's when claws and nails develop, right? All of these things have that. Now lizards have scales, and pigeons have feathers, and chimps and mice have hair, and really they're a very similar type of structure. So that's why it's considered, tied in kind of with this claws or nails type thing. Now we get to this common ancestor here, and although it still would have claws or nails, it did not have feathers or fur, and so sometime between node, see this is, I call this one A, B, C, D. So sometime between after node D, along this line, feathers developed, and along this line, fur and mammary glands develops. So, question. Is a lizard more closely related to a salamander or to a chimpanzee? Looking at this right here, is this lizard more closely related to the salamander, A, or the chimpanzee, B? Pick an answer. All right, so now let's think about this. I have a lot of students, most students say A when they're first going through this. And so let's look at that. Where is the common ancestor? Right here at this node, right? And so all these two guys would have in common lungs. They'd have jaws and they have lungs. They both have that trait. Now, where's the common ancestor between the chimp and lizard? Here. The chimp and lizard have both jaws, lungs, and claws or nails in common. And so therefore, these guys share more characteristics. Plus, when was their most common ancestor? Right here at this node, which is more recently than this node. So the correct answer for, is a lizard more closely related to the salamander or the chimp? The correct answer is B, the chimp. All right, let's try another one of these. So the lizard is more closely related to the chimp than it is to the salamander. Okay, so let's go with a similar type of question. All right. So we have the salamander here. Okay. Now, is it more closely related to the lizard, A, or the chimp, B? Or is it none of the above, C? So where's the common ancestor between a salamander and a lizard? What do they share? Jaws and lungs, and that's it. So the common ancestor, the node that they share in common right here, is right here at this point between the lizard and the salamander. Okay? Now, what is the common ancestor between the chimp and the salamander? Right here, right here. Well, it's the same exact spot. So the correct answer for that one is C. Notice I asked the same animals, I just asked about it in a different order. The salamander is equally related to the lizard and the chimp because their common ancestor occurred at the same place. So therefore they are equally related, both the lizard and the chimp, to the salamander because their common ancestor occurs at the same node. So you can see how some of these questions can be a little tricky. You can have totally different answers depending on how they ask the question and in which order. But really, as long as you go find the common node that they had, then the answers become really easy. Okay? So, is the giant panda right here more closely related to the lesser panda, also known as a red panda, or the spectacled bear? Well, if we look at this, their branch off, their node right here, so dogs branched off first, then raccoons and lesser pandas branched off right here, right? The giant bears, all the bears branch off here, with the rest of the bears branching off there and the giant panda kind of going off on its own way. So where's the common ancestor between the spectacled bear and the giant panda? This location. Where's the common ancestor between the lesser panda, also known as red panda, and the giant panda? Right here. So our options are here or here. Which one occurred more recently? Well, this one was more recent, right? Meaning that the giant panda is more closely related to the spectacled bear than he is to the lesser panda or red panda. All right, so let's go with the giant panda again. Is he more closely related to the spectacled bear or the brown bear? All right, again, find common ancestors. So we trace the giant panda back this way and this way. Here's the spectacled bear, it goes there. Their common node is right here, right? All right, so now the brown bear, we trace it here, we go there, we go there, we go there. And notice the node is at the same exact spot. So the giant panda is equally related to the spectacled and the brown bear because their common ancestor is the same common ancestor. We can also use what are called fan diagrams. It's really kind of the same thing. This shows a branch point between like mammals and birds and reptiles that happened more recently than, for example, the branch point between like fish and reptiles and birds. So modern taxonomy considers DNA as well as structure. So look at these animals down below. What are they? Well, students look at it and they say, well, those are vultures. That's easy. Well, they are. All right. According to previous classifications, all vultures belong to the same family. But they did some DNA testing, and they found that, excuse the pronunciation, I'm not even sure this is the correct way to pronounce it, but it's see what I mean? Excuse the pronunciation. Accipitridae. Accipitridae is this bird right, and it's not writing. It's this bird right here. This is the Nile vulture. This is an old world, meaning Africa and Europe and Asia. Cathartidae are the New World vultures, and these are like your turkey buzzards. They both have black feathers. They both have ugly faces that are bald, basically. They have sharp claws and talons and sharp beaks. They have an excellent, superior sense of smell. And yet, they're not very closely related. They did some genetic testing and they found out that these dudes right here are more closely related to storks, which I find completely hysterical and funny because storks bring babies, right? And vultures are a symbol of death. So, kind of funny. But these guys are more closely related to storks. And then the New World vultures are more closely related to hawks and eagles. And so they did some testing and really they found out they're not closely related at all. So why do they look so similar? Convergent evolution. I mean, think about it. They both eat dead things. They both eat dead things. And they have bald faces. That keeps them from getting bacteria trapped on their face. They both have dark feathers, which is great at absorbing UV light, which is great for killing bacteria and viruses and such on the surface of the bird, not internally or anything like that. And then they also have the sharp talons and claws because they, need to tear away the flesh of the dead thing that they're eating. Other genetic testing instances. So, for example, we always had two groups of elephants. We had Asiatic, also known as Indian elephants, and African elephants. And they were just considered two separate species. Then scientists did some testing of a bunch of the elephants, particularly the African elephants, and they found out, whoa, we have two groups here that are very different from each other. They look similarly externally, but genetically they're pretty different. And they now call them rainforest elephants, and then they have your desert/grassland elephants. The ones that live in the rainforest are genetically different enough that they consider them a different species. We have a different couple of ideas of species concepts. So first one's typological species concept, where you look at physical similarities. Now, that was a problem because, like, for example, here we have two vultures, and when you go based off of structure, convergent evolution can really mess with that. Then we had the biological species concept, where basically they said, well, if the two of them can breed and produce offspring, and that offspring then can breed with either of the parent populations, they're the same species. Like, for example, if we take a Doberman and I keep wanting to say Dachshund, but that would be kind of silly, but it would work. But let's just say a Doberman and like a German Shepherd. They could produce puppies, and the puppies then could breed with any other species of dog. Well, not species, breed of dog. And so we consider all dogs the same species. And genetically, they are very similar to wolves. So we consider even dogs and wolves the same species. However, like if you take a horse and a donkey, you get a mule. Mules are sterile. Another example of that is, like, for example, we can take a buffalo and a cow, and you can get a beefalo. But again, the beefalos are sterile. They can't breed with either cows or buffalo. Here we have a zorse. I think you know what that is. Zebra horse. This is a liger. Male lion, female tiger, and this is what we get. All right, it is sterile, cannot breed with either the lions or the tigers. Now, that being said, we do have some different species that can interbreed, like the two species of elephants I just mentioned. They bred them together in zoos for years and had no problems. None of the offspring were sterile. But genetically, they are pretty different. Another really good example of a hybrid animal are bears. We have had Growler bears, part grizzly, part polar bear, because polar bears are coming across grizzly bears more often because of the shrinking of the caps. Yet, I mean, those are pretty different animals. And even though genetically they're similar enough to produce offspring, really they're not that similar that they are not considered the same species. And so now the phylogenetic, it looks at both their breeding and their DNA. And that is everything for today.